I stared across the long dining table, forcing a polite smile as Ethan launched into another monologue about his next big business venture. The candlelight flickered over the expensive china, and for a moment, I wondered how he could sit there so casually, surrounded by things his wife Amelia insisted I buy for these family dinners. The tension was palpable, even if the others pretended not to notice. Ethan's eyes flicked toward me, a gleam of calculation flashing behind his boyish grin. Isabella, if anyone understands what it takes to succeed, it's you, he said, leaning forward as if he was sharing a great secret. I've been working on this project for months now, and all I need is just a little boost to really get it off the ground. The room quieted. My stomach nodded. Here we go again. Oh, I said, keeping my tone light, though the warning bells were already ringing. What kind of project? It's an expansion to my logistics company, Ethan said, waving his hands as if painting a masterpiece. A new fleet of eco friendly trucks. It's a big investment, but it's going to revolutionize the industry. I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my wine to buy time. Ethan's company barely scraped by as it was, and I doubted he could even spell eco friendly, let alone implement it. That sounds ambitious, I said. What kind of support are you looking for? Ethan leaned back with a casual shrug that felt entirely rehearsed. Just a small loan. Nothing crazy. Maybe 100,000? I'll pay you back in 6 months, with interest, of course. Amelia, seated beside him, chimed in with a sugary sweet smile. Ethan's so passionate about this, Isabella. You understand, right? Family helping family. I felt my jaw tighten. Family helping family. The phrase had been used against me too many times. But I glanced around the table at the expectant faces, my husband, his parents, his cousins, and I felt the familiar weight of obligation settling on my chest. I'll think about it, I said finally. Send me the details, and I'll see what I can do. Ethan's face lit up, and he reached across the table to pat my hand. I knew I could count on you. The rest of dinner passed in a haze of forced laughter and small talk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a mistake. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering why I couldn't just say no. A week later, the first crack appeared. I was reviewing reports in my office when a notification popped up on my phone, a photo of Ethan, grinning ear to ear, standing next to a brand new sports car. The caption read, "Hard work pays off." I felt my blood pressure spike. I dialed his number immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice as casual as ever. "Hey, Isabella. What's up?" "I just saw your post," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "You bought a car? With the loan money?" There was a pause, then a laugh that grated on my nerves. "Relax, Bella. It's not what it looks like. The car's a lease. Just something to boost my image, attract more clients." "You told me the money was for your company," I said sharply. "This doesn't look like an investment in eco-friendly trucks." "Don't be so uptight," Ethan said, his tone shifting to annoyance. "I'm working on the business. The car is part of that. You have to spend money to make money, right?" I clenched my teeth. "Ethan, I trusted you." "And I appreciate that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, everything's under control. I'll pay you back, just like I promised." But something in his tone made it clear he didn't think I had any right to question him. I ended the call, my hands trembling with anger. The next few weeks were a series of small, calculated betrayals. Amelia began dropping comments at family gatherings about how stingy I was with my success, always loud enough for others to overhear. Ethan started hinting to my husband that I wasn't supportive enough of his dreams. Every time I confronted them, they brushed me off with excuses and accusations, twisting the narrative until I felt like the villain. Then came the breaking point. I was sitting in my office, going through some property documents, when I noticed something strange. The deed to a family heirloom property, a vineyard left to me by my parents, was missing. After hours of frantic searching, I discovered the truth. Ethan had mortgaged it behind my back. I couldn't breathe. That vineyard wasn't just a piece of land. It was a part of my family's legacy, a place my parents had poured their hearts into building. And Ethan had gambled it away like it was nothing. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother to hide his smirk. I had no choice, he said, shrugging as if this was all perfectly reasonable. The vineyard was just sitting there and used. I figured you wouldn't mind. Wouldn't mind. My voice shook with disbelief. That property is my parents' legacy. You had no right. Calm down, Isabella, he said, rolling his eyes. You're acting like I sold it. It's just a mortgage. You can pay it off easily with the kind of money you make. I felt the room spinning around me. You forged my signature, Ethan. That's illegal. Oh, come on, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. You're blowing this way out of proportion. You've got millions. What's a little mortgage to you? Family helps family, right? His words felt like a slap in the face. Family helps family. The same phrase they had used to guilt me into giving, again and again, until there was nothing left but resentment and betrayal. I realized then that this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about control, about entitlement, about people who saw me as a resource to exploit rather than a person to respect. I stared at Ethan, his smug face staring me to fight back, and for the first time, I felt something snap inside me. No, I said, my voice steady and firm. Family doesn't do this to each other, and I'm done being your hating. I walked away, his protests fading into the background. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. I thought cutting Ethan off would bring some peace, but I underestimated how deep his sense of entitlement ran. A week after our confrontation, I received a call from my mother-in-law. Her tone was sharp, more accusatory than concerned. Isabella, she started, not bothering with pleasantries, Ethan told me what happened. I can't believe you'd turn your back on family like this. I took a deep breath. He forged my signature, mortgaged my property, and spent the money irresponsibly. How is that my fault? Her scoff was loud enough to make me flinch. Oh, please. It's not like you don't have the means to fix it. Ethan is under a lot of pressure, and all you've done is make things harder for him. You know, you wouldn't even have this success if it weren't for our family supporting you early on. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice cold. Exactly how did you support me? I've worked for everything I have. You think you did it all alone? She snapped. We welcomed you into this family. We stood by you when no one else would. You owe us, Isabella. I hung up without another word, my hands trembling. The narrative they were spinning was absurd, but it wasn't just her. Over the next few days, I heard variations of the same thing from different family members. Amelia had apparently taken it upon herself to tell everyone that I was selfish, cold-hearted, and unwilling to help. The whispers turned into glares, and soon enough, I was the villain in every room. My husband, Alex, tried to stay neutral, but his silence hurt more than the accusations. When I told him what his brother had done, he shook his head and sighed, as if I was making too much of a fuss. Isabella, I know Ethan can be a bit irresponsible, but he's family. Maybe you could just let this go. It's not worth all this fighting. Let it go. I repeated, incredulous. He stole from me, Alex. He jeopardized my parents' legacy, and you want me to just let it go? He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my eyes. I just don't want to see the family fall apart over money. Can't you talk to him? I was on my own. Something out. The betrayal stung, but it also fueled something in me, a determination to fight back. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything I'd built. The next day, I hired a private investigator. If Ethan was willing to forge my signature, who knew what else he was hiding? Within a week, I had a stack of evidence that painted a damning picture. Ethan wasn't just reckless. He was a con artist. He had borrowed money from other family members, promising outrageous returns, and never paid them back. He had lied about his business's earnings to secure loans, some of which were already in default. And worst of all, he had funneled money into personal luxuries while pretending to be on the brink of financial ruin. Armed with this information, I went to Alex. I laid the evidence out in front of him, expecting him to finally see reason. But his response left me speechless. This is going to destroy him, he said, shaking his head. Isabella, do you really want to ruin Ethan's life over this? He's your brother-in-law. I stared at him, my heart sinking. He's been ruining his own life, Alex. All I'm doing is protecting myself. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said, his voice rising. Family is complicated. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices. The word sacrifices echoed in my mind. I had sacrificed my peace, my finances, my reputation, and now Alex was asking me to sacrifice my dignity. I stood up, gathering the papers. If you can't stand by me on this, then I don't know what we're even doing, I said quietly. I'm going to handle this on my own. That night, I drafted a formal notice to Ethan, demanding he repay the money and relinquish the vineyard or face legal consequences. The next morning, I sent it through my lawyer. I thought it would end there, but Ethan wasn't done with me yet. 2 days later, I received a call from a reporter asking about allegations of tax fraud in my company. At first, I was confused, but as the questions continued, it became clear that someone had fed them false information. My stomach churned as I realized who was behind it: Ethan. When I confronted him, he didn't even bother denying it. You think you can scare me with your fancy lawyers? He sneered. Two can play this game, Isabella. I know people. I can ruin you if I want to. I felt my hands shaking, but I refused to let him see my fear. You're digging your own grave, Ethan. Keep pushing, and I'll make sure everyone sees exactly who you are. He laughed. Oh, I'm not the one with everything to lose. Think about it. Do you really want this fight? For a moment, I did think about it. He wasn't wrong. I had worked so hard to build my business, my reputation, my life. And now it felt like everything was crumbling because I had dared to say no. But then I thought about my parents, about the sacrifices they had made to give me a better life. They had taught me to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. I wasn't going to let Ethan take that away from me. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the evidence in front of me. The vineyard, the forged documents, the stolen money. It all pointed to one truth: Ethan had never seen me as family. To him, I was just a means to an end, a resource to exploit. And now, I had to decide how far I was willing to go to protect myself. The answer was clear. I wasn't just fighting for my money or my property. I was fighting for my peace, my dignity, and my right to live without fear of being manipulated. Ethan had taken enough from me. It was time to take it all back. The family gathering was at my in-laws' house, a sprawling estate that Ethan liked to boast about, even though most of it had been paid for by loans he'd never repay. I wasn't in the mood to pretend everything was fine, but I had planned for this moment carefully. Tonight, I wasn't just defending myself. I was reclaiming what was mine. As I walked into the dining room, the chatter died down. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, wearing the same smug expression he always had when he thought he was in control. Amelia was next to him, whispering something to my mother-in-law, who glanced at me with thinly veiled disdain. Alex was already seated, his shoulders tense, avoiding my gaze. Isabella, Ethan said, his voice oozing false cheerfulness. So glad you could make it. I was just telling everyone about how hard it's been for the family to stay united lately. With all the misunderstandings. I didn't sit. Instead, I placed a thick folder on the table in front of me. The weight of the documents felt like a shield. All eyes turned to it, curiosity flickering across their faces. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. I think it's time we cleared up those misunderstandings, I said. I've been quiet for too long, and I've let lies go unchecked. But not anymore. The room fell silent. Ethan's smirk faltered for a split second before he leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. Oh, come on, Bella. Is this really necessary? We're family. We should be working things out, not making a scene. I ignored him and opened the folder, pulling out the first set of documents. This is a record of the loans you've taken out in my name without my permission, including the mortgage on my family's vineyard. You forged my signature, Ethan. That's fraud. Gasps rippled around the table. My mother-in-law's hand flew to her chest, and Amelia's face turned pale. Ethan, however, leaned forward, his expression hardening. That's ridiculous, he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. You can't prove that. I held up another document. Actually, I can. Here's a handwriting analysis confirming that the signature isn't mine. And here, I added, pulling out a bank statement, is proof that you funneled the money from the mortgage directly into your personal account. The room erupted. My father in law muttered something under his breath, and Alex finally looked up, his face a mix of shock and guilt. Ethan raised his hands, trying to calm the chaos. This is a mistake, he said, his voice rising. Isabella's blowing things out of proportion. I only did this because I knew she'd never agree to help otherwise. She's been hoarding all her wealth while the rest of us struggle. Hoarding, I repeated, my voice sharp. Ethan, I've given you money countless times. I've helped pay your debts, supported your so-called business ventures, and covered for you when you couldn't. And how did you repay me? By stealing from me and smearing my name. You're making it sound worse than it is. Amelia cut in, her voice trembling. We're family. Families help each other. Families don't steal. I shot back. Families don't manipulate and lie and threaten each other. What you've done isn't about family, it's about greed. Ethan stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. His mask of calm had shattered, revealing the fury underneath. You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Sitting on your millions, acting like you're some kind of saint. Well, let me tell you something, Isabella. You wouldn't even be where you are if it weren't for this family. We made you. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the tense silence. Made me? Everything I have, I earned. While you've been leeching off anyone who would listen, I've been working. Don't you dare take credit for my success. Ethan's face turned red, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. But then he smiled, a cruel, cold smile that sent a shiver down my spine. You're going to regret this, he said. You think you can humiliate me in front of my family and get away with it? I'll ruin you, Isabella. I'll make sure everyone sees the truth about who you really are. That's enough. Alex's voice cut through the tension, louder than I'd ever heard him. He stood up, looking between Ethan and me, his face pale but determined. Ethan, you've crossed a line. You've been lying to all of us, using Isabella for years. And now you're threatening her? You need to stop. As if he couldn't believe Alex was taking my side. But I couldn't take comfort in it. Not yet. This isn't just about me, I said, turning to the rest of the family. Ethan has been lying to all of you. He's borrowed money from almost everyone here and never paid it back. He's put this family at risk because he thinks he's entitled to whatever he wants. And if we keep enabling him, he's only going to keep taking. The room was silent again, the weight of my words sinking in. Finally, my father-in-law cleared his throat. Isabella's right, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We've let this go on for too long. Ethan started to protest, but his mother cut him off. No, Ethan, this has to stop. You've hurt this family enough. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest start to ease. I'm taking legal action to recover what's mine, I said. But beyond that, I'm done. I won't be part of this toxic cycle anymore. Ethan stared at me, his eyes full of hatred, but he didn't say another word. He knew he had lost. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The family was shaken, but I could feel a shift, an understanding that things needed to change. As I left the house, Alex walked me to the car. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have stood up for you sooner. I nodded, not ready to forgive, but grateful for the small step forward. This isn't over, Alex. I still have a lot to fix. I know, he said, but I'm with you now. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, I felt free to rebuild my life without the weight of their greed dragging me down. And I vowed to never let anyone take that from me again. The morning after the family confrontation, I woke up feeling lighter, though the reality of what lay ahead quickly set in. Exposing Ethan was just the beginning. His threats still echoed in my mind, a reminder that he wasn't going to go quietly. I had to prepare for whatever he might throw at me. It wasn't just about protecting my assets anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life. My first step was meeting with my lawyer, Sitting in her sleek downtown office, I laid everything out: the forged documents, the stolen money, the threats. She listened carefully, her sharp eyes scanning the evidence I handed over. "This is solid," she said, flipping through the pages. "But you need to be prepared for fight. People like Ethan don't back down easily, especially when their backs are against the wall." "I know," I said, "but I can't let him get away with this. He's already done enough damage." She nodded, her expression firm. "We'll start by filing a claim to nullify the mortgage on your vineyard. Once that's done, we can press charges for the forgery and fraud. It's going to get messy, Isabella. Are you ready for that?" I hesitated for a moment, but then I thought about everything Ethan had taken from me: my peace, my trust, my family's legacy. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Leaving the office, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. For too long, I had let guilt and obligation hold me back. Now I was finally taking action. But as determined as I felt, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Ethan wasn't the type to admit defeat. Sure enough, the retaliation began almost immediately. That afternoon, my assistant rushed into my office, her face pale. "Isabella," she said, holding her phone out to me, "you need to see this." It was a social media post from a fake account claiming my company was under investigation for tax fraud. The post was vague but inflammatory, filled with enough accusations to make anyone who read it think twice about doing business with me. The comments were already piling up, and my heart sank as I realized this was Ethan's doing. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This was exactly the kind of move he would make: spiteful, petty, and designed to hurt me where it mattered most. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. "Get the PR team on this immediately," I told my assistant. "I want a statement out by the end of the day. Make it clear that these claims are false and that we're taking legal action against whoever is behind them." She nodded and rushed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As much as I hated to admit it, Ethan had found a weak spot. My business was my lifeline, the thing I had worked hardest to build. If he managed to tarnish my reputation, it would take years to rebuild. That evening, I received a call from Alex. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Isabella," he said, "I saw the post. Are you okay?" "I'm handling it," I said, my tone clipped. "But I know this was Ethan." He sighed. "I talked to him earlier. He's not in a good place right now. He's lashing out." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Alex, I don't care what kind of place he's in. He's trying to ruin me. Do you understand that?" "I know," he said quickly. "And I told him he needs to stop. But Isabella, maybe you could. If you're about to suggest I forgive him or let this go, don't," I said, cutting him off. "I've given him enough chances, and all he's done is take advantage of me. This ends now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Alex finally spoke. "You're right," he said quietly. I hate seeing the family fall apart like this." "It was already broken," I said. "Ethan just made it impossible to ignore." After we hung up, I felt a pang of sadness. As much as I hated to admit it, Alex's loyalty to his family was wearing thin on me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep trying to bridge the gap between us when he refused to see the truth. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal filings, and damage control. The PR team worked tirelessly to counter the rumors Ethan had spread, while my lawyer moved forward with a case against him. I poured myself into the fight, determined not to let him win. But the more I fought back, the more isolated I felt. My in-laws avoided me, their loyalty to Ethan blinding them to the damage he had caused. Even Alex was distant, caught between supporting me and trying to maintain peace within his family. It was lonely, but I reminded myself that this was about more than just me. This was about standing up for what was right. One afternoon, as I was going over the latest updates with my lawyer, she looked up from her notes and gave me a rare smile. "We're making progress," she said. "The bank is cooperating with our claim, and it looks like we'll be able to reclaim the vineyard soon." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this fight was far from over. Ethan still had his claws in too many places, and I knew he wouldn't give up easily. Later that evening, I drove out to the vineyard. It had been months since I'd last visited, and stepping onto the property felt like a homecoming. The air was crisp, the rows of grapevines stretching out before me like a reminder of everything my parents had worked for. As I stood there, I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just a fight for my business or my reputation. This was a fight for my family's legacy, for the values my parents had instilled in me. Ethan could spread all the lies he wanted, but he couldn't take that away from me. I left the vineyard with a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how long it took or how hard it got, I was going to see this through. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everything I believed in. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both literally and figuratively. As I sat at the long wooden table next to my lawyer, the sterile smell of polished floors and old paperwork filled the air. Across the room, Ethan sat with his own attorney, fidgeting in his chair. He wouldn't meet my gaze, which was just as well. I wasn't sure I could keep my composure if I had to look into those smug, calculating eyes. The hearing was only the beginning of a long process to reclaim what was mine, but it was a critical step. My lawyer had filed a motion to nullify the fraudulent mortgage on my family's vineyard, and today, the bank's representative would testify to the forgery. I felt the weight of my parents' legacy pressing down on me, a reminder of why I was here. Ethan's lawyer began with a weak defense, claiming that Ethan had been acting in the family's best interests when he mortgaged the property. He painted Ethan as a well-meaning but struggling businessman who had made a technical error in the paperwork. I wanted to laugh at the audacity of it, but instead, I kept my expression neutral, letting my lawyer presented the evidence. The forged signature, the bank statements, and a handwriting analysis that left no room for doubt. The judge's face remained impassive, but I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw as he reviewed the documents. Ethan squirmed in his seat, his bravado slowly unraveling. Then came the bank representative's testimony. She confirmed that Ethan had submitted the documents without my knowledge and that the loan had been approved under false pretenses. Her calm, professional demeanor made Ethan's defense look even more ridiculous. By the time she finished, the air in the room felt heavier, like everyone was holding their breath. When the judge announced his decision to nullify the mortgage, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly cried. The vineyard was safe, at least for now. But the fight wasn't over. There were still the fraud charges and the ongoing smear campaign Ethan had orchestrated against me. As I left the courthouse, I reminded myself that this was just one battle in a much larger war. Outside, Alex was waiting for me. His face was a mix of pride and something I couldn't quite place, guilt, maybe, or uncertainty. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, not ready to let him into my space. "You did great in there," he said, his voice soft. "I'm proud of you." "Thanks," I said shortly. I wanted to feel comforted by his presence, but his earlier indecision still lingered between us like a wall. "It's not over yet, though." "I know," he said, "but this is a win. You deserve to celebrate that." I nodded, though I didn't feel much like celebrating. Instead, I told him I needed time to think and drove out to the vineyard. Standing among the rows of grapevines, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in weeks. The air was cool and smelled faintly of earth and sunlight. For a moment, I let myself breathe, imagining my parents walking these fields, their laughter carried on the wind. But the peace didn't last long. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, I saw another barrage of messages from family members. Some were supportive, congratulating me on my legal victory, but most were angry, accusing me of tearing the family apart. Amelia, true to form, had spread the story far and wide, twisting the facts to make Ethan look like a victim. "You've ruined everything," one text read. "I hope you're happy." I wasn't happy. I was tired, angry, and sad. But more than that, I was determined. These messages only confirmed what I had known for weeks. This family had never truly been on my side. They had taken Ethan's lies at face value because it was easier than confronting the truth. And now that the truth was out, they didn't want to deal with the fallout. I decided then and there that I was done trying to win their approval. I wasn't going to waste any more energy defending myself to people who refused to see reason. My focus would be on rebuilding what Ethan had tried to destroy: my reputation, my business, and my peace of mind. The next morning, I met with my PR team to strategize. The false allegations of tax fraud were still circulating, and while we had managed to quash some of the rumors, the damage to my reputation was undeniable. My head of PR, a sharp, no nonsense woman named Rachel, laid out a plan to counteract the narrative. "We need to remind people who you are," she said. "Your philanthropic work, your success story, it all needs to be front and center. We'll do interviews, release statements, and push positive stories about the work your company is doing." I nodded, appreciating her clear headed approach. "Let's do it," I said, "whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the work. I gave interviews about the challenges of being a self made entrepreneur, highlighting the values my parents had instilled in me. I attended charity events, met with community leaders, and doubled down on my efforts to support local businesses through my foundation. Slowly but surely, the narrative began to shift. People started seeing me not as the cold, calculating figure Ethan had painted, but as someone who had overcome adversity and refused to back down in the face of betrayal. Ethan, meanwhile, was unraveling. His business was failing, his lies were catching up to him, and the family members who had initially defended him were starting to see the truth. I didn't take pleasure in his downfall, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. One evening, as I was leaving my office, Alex called. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I was ready for another conversation about his brother. But his voice was different this time, gentler, almost hesitant. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, "for not standing by you sooner. I should have had your back from the beginning." I didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say. Finally, I settled on the truth. "You hurt me, Alex. I needed you, and you weren't there." "I know," he said quietly, "and I hate that I let you down. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right." I wanted to believe him. Part of me even did. But trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. "We'll see," I said finally. Actions speak louder than words. As I hung up, I felt a strange mix of hope and caution. This fight had shown me who I could trust and who I couldn't. And while I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let anyone, family or not, stand in the way of the life I was rebuilding. The day I stood in front of the vineyard with a final court ruling in my hand, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The property was officially mine again, free from Ethan's reckless schemes, but the victory didn't feel as triumphant as I'd imagined. Maybe it was because of all the relationships I've lost along the way, or maybe it was because I knew the fight with Ethan wasn't entirely over. Either way, I was tired, bone deep tired, and ready to focus on what mattered. Walking through the rows of grapevines, I let my fingers trail over the leaves. My parents had worked so hard to build this place, and now it was mine to protect. The air smelled sweet, earthy, alive, a reminder that not everything Ethan tried to take had been lost. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But peace didn't last long. When I got back to my car, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The moment I read it, my chest tightened. "You may have won the vineyard, but this isn't over. I know things that could destroy you. You'll regret crossing me." It didn't take a genius to figure out who sent it. Ethan wasn't finished with his threats, and I knew he'd stop at nothing to drag me down with him. My instinct was to ignore it, but I forwarded the message to my lawyer instead. If Ethan wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready. Later that evening, I sat in my living room, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. Alex was sitting across from me, silent, but clearly wanting to say something. His guilt had been palpable since the courtroom victory, and while I appreciated his efforts to support me now, I couldn't shake the memory of how absent he'd been when I needed him most. "Ethan's not going to stop," I said finally, breaking the silence. "He's going to keep coming at me until there's nothing left." Alex leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "He's desperate, Isabella. He's losing everything: his business, his reputation. He doesn't know how to handle it. That's not an excuse, I snapped. Do you know how much damage he's done? Not just to me, but to everyone who ever trusted him. He's burned every bridge, and now he's trying to set fire to what's left. Alex looked down at his hands, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to respond. But then he sighed and met my eyes. You're right, he said quietly. There's no excuse for what he's done. I just, I don't know how to fix this. I shook my head, feeling a pang of sadness. You can't fix this, Alex. Neither can I. The only thing I can do is protect myself and make sure he doesn't take anything else from me. The next morning, I met with my lawyer again to discuss the message. She was confident that the threats would work in my favor if we decided to press criminal charges, but part of me hesitated. Going after Ethan legally had already torn the family apart, and I wasn't sure how much more damage I could handle. Still, I knew I couldn't let him think he could intimidate me. While we were talking, my phone buzzed again, this time a call from an old family friend. I hesitated before answering, unsure if it was another guilt trip waiting to happen, but her tone was warm and supportive. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you, she said. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've done the right
Her
thing.
words hit me
Your
harder than I
parents would be
expected,
proud, too. And I blinked back tears. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. The call reminded me that not everyone had turned against me. There were still people who believed in me, who saw the truth for what it was. And as much as Ethan's actions had hurt, they had also shown me who I could truly count on. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding. The vineyard became my sanctuary, a place where I could find clarity and purpose. I spent hours walking the grounds, planning renovations and brainstorming ways to make the property more profitable. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about honoring my parents' legacy and building something they would have been proud of. Meanwhile, Ethan's life continued to unravel. His business officially declared bankruptcy, and rumors circulated that he and Amelia were on the brink of divorce. I didn't take pleasure in his downfall, but I couldn't deny the sense of justice it brought. He had sown the seeds of his own destruction, and now he was reaping the consequences. One evening, as I was going over plans for the vineyard, Alex walked in with a hesitant expression. He sat down across from me, fiddling with his hands before finally speaking. I know I haven't been the husband you needed, he said, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to do better, Isabella. I want to earn back your trust. I studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with a single conversation. It's going to take time, I said finally, and I need to see that you mean it, not just for me, but for yourself. He nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, not just for our marriage, but for my future as a whole. The next day, I finalized the plans to reopen the vineyard as a boutique winery. It would take time and effort, but I was excited about the possibilities. This wasn't just about reclaiming what Ethan had tried to take. It was about building something new, something stronger. As I stood on the balcony overlooking the fields, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The sun was setting, casting the vines in a golden light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe. Ethan had tried to break me, but he hadn't succeeded. I had faced his lies, his manipulation, and his threats, and I had come out the other side stronger. This was my life, my legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me again. The family gathering was tense from the moment I walked in. It wasn't a celebratory dinner or a holiday event. This was a meeting called by Alex's parents, supposedly to clear the air after everything that had happened. I wasn't naive enough to think it would end well, but I had decided to attend for one reason. I needed to put an end to this once and for all. The dining room felt smaller than usual, the heavy air pressing down on everyone seated around the table. Ethan was already there, sitting at the far end, his face a carefully constructed mask of innocence. Amelia was beside him, whispering to Alex's mother, who threw me a cold glance as I took my seat. Alex sat next to me, his body stiff with unease. The conversation started politely enough, strained small talk about work, the weather, anything to avoid the elephant in the room. But it didn't take long for Ethan to break the facade. Well, since we're all here, he said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity, I think we should address the real issue. Isabella's insistence on dragging this family through the mud. I felt Alex stiffen beside me, but I kept my expression neutral. The real issue, I said calmly, is your repeated dishonesty and the damage you've caused, not just to me, but to everyone in this room. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if I were the unreasonable one. Oh, come on. You're acting like I've ruined your life. All I ever tried to do was provide for my family. Maybe I made a few mistakes, but at least I was trying. Trying, I said, my voice rising slightly. You forged my signature, mortgaged my parents' vineyard, and spread lies about me to anyone who would listen. That's not trying. That's manipulation, theft, and slander. You're blowing this way out of proportion, Amelia interjected, her voice sharp. Ethan made some bad decisions, sure, but he doesn't deserve to be vilified like this. He's family, Isabella. You're supposed to support family. I stared at her, incredulous. Support? You mean like the way you spread rumors about me being selfish and ungrateful? Or the way you stood by while Ethan tried to ruin my business? That's not family, Amelia. That's exploitation. Alex's father cleared his throat, his deep voice cutting through the rising tension. Enough. We didn't call this meeting to argue. We're here to find a way to move forward. There's only one way forward, I said, my tone firm. Ethan needs to take responsibility for what he's done. No more excuses, no more lies. He needs to stop dragging this family down with him. Ethan's face darkened, his carefully composed mask cracking. Oh, please, he spat. You think you're so much better than the rest of us, don't you? Sitting on your high horse with all your money and your perfect little business. You wouldn't even have any of it if it weren't for this family. I felt a flash of anger, but I kept my voice steady. I built my business from the ground up. I've worked for everything I have. The only thing this family has given me is a series of betrayals and a reminder of how much stronger I am without you. The table fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Ethan glared at me, his jaw tight, while Amelia looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. Alex's mother started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. This ends now, I said, my voice firm but calm. Ethan, you've burned every bridge you had. You've lied, stolen, and manipulated your way through life, and now you're facing the consequences. I'm done trying to fix things or make peace. From this point on, I'm cutting ties. Completely. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a bitter smirk on his face. Fine, he said. But don't come crying to me when you realize you can't handle the fallout. I ignored him, turning to the rest of the family. This isn't just about me. Ethan has taken advantage of all of you in some way, and if you keep enabling him, he'll keep doing it. I can't tell you what to do, but I'm telling you what I'm doing. I'm walking away. Alex's father looked down at his hands, clearly conflicted. Alex's mother opened her mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die in her throat. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Isabella's right, he said. I've tried to see both sides, but there's no excuse for what Ethan's done. If we keep enabling him, we're just as much to blame. Ethan's face turned red, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. But instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You want to cut ties? Fine, he said, glaring at me. But don't think for a second that this makes you better than me. You're just as selfish as the rest of us. With that, he stormed out of the room, Amelia trailing after him. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest start to ease. It wasn't a victory exactly, but it felt like the closure I needed. For the first time in months, I felt free from the lies, the guilt, and the constant need to defend myself. The rest of the evening was subdued. Alex's parents apologized, though their words felt more like an attempt to smooth things over than genuine remorse. Alex stayed by my side, his presence a quiet reassurance. By the time we left, I felt a sense of finality, as if a chapter of my life had finally come to a close. Driving home, I looked over at Alex. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for standing by me tonight." He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I should have done it sooner," he said, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope.
When we got
Not
home,
just for our
I
future,
poured
but
myself
for
a glass
mine.
of wine and sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my skin.
The fight with Ethan had taken so much from me, but it had also given me clarity. I knew who I was now, and I knew what I was capable of. I wasn't just a victim of his manipulation, I was a survivor, stronger and more determined than ever. And as I sipped my wine, staring into the flames, I made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone take that strength away from me again. The morning after that final confrontation with Ethan, I woke up feeling a strange combination of relief and emptiness. I had cut ties with someone who had poisoned my life for years, and yet the weight of what I'd lost lingered. Family, even at its most toxic, is hard to leave behind. But as I stared out the window at the soft light spilling over the city, I reminded myself that I hadn't lost anything worth keeping. What I had gained was freedom, freedom from the lies, the guilt, and the manipulation. I spent the next few days tying up loose ends. My lawyer assured me that the vineyard was secure and that Ethan's attempts to drag me down further had no legal standing. The false allegations of tax fraud had been debunked, and my PR team had done an incredible job restoring my reputation. Still, the scars remained, both personal and professional. Ethan had burned bridges not just with me, but with others in the family, and I knew the damage he'd caused would take time to heal. Alex was making an effort, and while I appreciated it, I was careful not to let him too close too quickly. Trust was something he'd have to earn back, one step at a time. He showed up for me in small ways, bringing me coffee during long nights of work, helping with plans for the vineyard, and most importantly, staying quiet when I needed space. It wasn't a grand gesture I wanted from him. It was consistency, and so far, he was delivering. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch, Alex broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice hesitant, "about how much I let you down. And you were right. I should have been on your side from the start." I sipped my tea, considering his words. "You didn't just let me down, Alex," I said gently. "You let yourself down too. By staying silent, you allowed Ethan to keep hurting people. And I don't know if I can forgive that." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not yet. But I want you to know I'm trying to be better. For you and for myself." His honesty caught me off guard, but it was a step in the right direction. "That's all I can ask," I said softly. "Just don't stop trying." As we sat there, watching the stars blink into view, I felt a glimmer of hope. Our relationship wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was still worth fighting for, as long as he was willing to meet me halfway. Meanwhile, the vineyard became my sanctuary. I poured my energy into revitalizing the property, meeting with architects, landscapers, and winemakers to turn it into something more than it had been before. It wasn't just about reclaiming my parents' legacy. It was about building a future I could be proud of. The rows of grapevines, stretching endlessly under the sun, became a symbol of my resilience. Every decision I made felt like a step toward reclaiming not just the land, but also my sense of self. One afternoon, while walking the vineyard with my project manager, I noticed a small plaque near the entrance that I had never paid much attention to before. It bore my parents' names, along with a quote: "What we leave behind is as important as what we create." The word struck me deeply, a reminder of why I was doing all of this. My parents had built this place with love and care, and it was my responsibility to honor that. The idea came to me later that night, as I sat in the small office I'd set up on the property. I decided to create a foundation in their honor, one that would support young entrepreneurs in need of resources and mentorship. It was something my parents would have been proud of, and it felt like a way to turn all the pain and betrayal I'd experienced into something positive. When I announced the foundation at a small gathering of friends and colleagues, The response was overwhelming. People came forward with donations, offers to volunteer, and stories of how they or someone they knew had struggled to start a business. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just fighting to survive. Ethan's absence in my life became less of a wound and more of a scar, a reminder of the battles I'd fought and won. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Amelia had moved out of the city, their lives in shambles. His business was gone, his reputation destroyed, and most of the family had distanced themselves from him. It was a fitting end for someone who had spent years exploiting others, but I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt pity, not for what he'd lost, but for what he could have been if he'd chosen a different path. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the vineyard, I stood on the balcony of the newly renovated tasting room, watching the light dance across the vines. Alex joined me, 2 glasses of wine in hand, and for a while, we stood in silence, taking in the view. "You've done something incredible here," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Your parents would be proud." I smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Thank you," I said. "It hasn't been easy, but it feels right." He handed me a glass, and we toasted to the future. Not just mine, but ours. There was still a lot of work to do, both on the vineyard and in our relationship, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the evening deepened and the stars began to fill the sky, I reflected on everything that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal, the pain, the fights, they had all shaped me, but they didn't define me. What defined me was my resilience, my ability to stand up for myself and build something beautiful out of the ashes. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I had fought for this life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me again. This was my story, my legacy, and my chance to create something meaningful. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to embrace it. The grand opening of the vineyard's new tasting room was a day I would never forget. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sweetness of ripened grapes, and the sun cast a golden glow over the rolling fields. The property looked transformed, with fresh landscaping, warm wood accents, and a modern elegance that still honored its history. Guests mingled, sipping glasses of wine, their laughter and conversation filling the space with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I stood near the entrance, greeting everyone who arrived. Friends, colleagues, and even a few supportive family members had come to celebrate. Seeing their smiles and hearing their kind words made all the struggles leading up to this day feel worth it. This wasn't just a reopening, it was a rebirth for both the vineyard and for me. As the event went on, I found myself drawn to the small plaque near the entrance, the one with my parents' names and the quote that had inspired so much of this journey. "What we leave behind is as important as what we create." I ran my fingers over the engraving, a bittersweet ache settling in my chest. They weren't here to see this, but I felt their presence in every detail: the sturdy vines, the rich aroma of the wine, and the warmth of the community gathered to celebrate. Alex joined me after a while, a glass of wine in hand. He had been quiet for most of the event, letting me take center stage, but his presence had been steady and supportive. As he stood beside me, he looked out at the vineyard with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This place is incredible," he said after a moment. "You've done something truly amazing here." "Thank you," I said, offering him a small smile. "It feels like the beginning of something new." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not just the vineyard. You show me what strength looks like, Isabella. Watching you rebuild, fight for what's right, it's changed the way I see things, the way I see us." I looked at him, searching for the sincerity behind his words. For the first time in a long while, I believed him. He had stood by me through the final months of this ordeal, proving his loyalty not through grand gestures, but through consistency. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to give me hope. "We're not the same as we were," I said finally, "but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we needed to grow, separately and together." "I'm ready to grow," he said quietly, "and I want to grow with you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with promise. I didn't respond right away, but I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. It wasn't forgiveness, not
Later, as
entirely,
the
but
sun began
it
to
was a
set,
step forward. I climbed to the balcony of the tasting room, looking out over the vineyard. The golden light bathed the fields, turning the leaves to fire and the hills to liquid gold. It was the kind of beauty that made you stop and breathe, the kind that reminded you of life's quiet, enduring moments of grace. From up there, I could see the guests below, still laughing and enjoying the wine. The foundation I'd created in my parents' honor was already gaining momentum, with several of the attendees expressing interest in supporting it. The thought filled me with pride, knowing that something good had come from so much pain. Ethan, of course, wasn't there. The silence around his name was almost louder than his absence. I knew some people still harbored sympathy for him, but most had come to see the truth. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I didn't feel hatred toward him anymore, only a quiet, distant pity. He had squandered every opportunity to change, and now he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. As I stood there, sipping my wine and watching the light fade, a sense of peace settled over me. This was what I had fought for, not just the vineyard, but the chance to live a life free from manipulation and fear. I had built something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. When the last of the guests had gone and the vineyard was quiet again, I took a final walk through the rows of grapevines. The air was cool now, carrying the faint hum of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. I let myself linger, touching the vines and feeling the connection to my parents, to the past, to everything that had brought me here. As I reached the end of the row, I looked back at the tasting room, its lights glowing softly in the distance. This place wasn't just a vineyard anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the strength it took to rebuild after everything had fallen apart. I thought about my parents, about what they would have said if they could see me now. I imagined my mother's proud smile and my father's steady hand on my shoulder, and I felt a swell of emotion so strong it brought tears to my eyes. They had left me this legacy, and I had honored it. I had fought for it, and now I had made it my own. As I turned to head back to the house, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Each one felt like a tiny point of light, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always something worth holding on to. I smiled, feeling a quiet strength settle within me. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. But it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that I could face whatever came next. I had fought for this life, and it was mine. Finally, fully, completely mine.